Yes, I'm James R. Crumley, Jr. We have always had the theological position that a person bears a title only so long as a person fills the office. I have quit trying to explain to people, however, that I'm no longer bishop, simply because it just isn't understood that way. But we have not liked the term bishop emeritus. I asked the council not to do that because we were still in the throes of defining just what a bishop was to be. And I did not want any accretions that might come from another tradition that would begin to determine what we meant by the episcopal office. And so I had to be very careful since 1988 not to use the term bishop. But as I say, I have been forced into it in a great many ways and places.
Even if you pull over for a traffic stop?
No.
Are you happy? Mm-hmm. Yeah? Okay. Let's begin, if you wouldn't mind, with your own story. To recount for me your professional career briefly.
Yes, I grew up in East Tennessee, near Bristol. Our post office was Bluff City, Tennessee, but I grew up on a farm. I was recounting to someone yesterday that my first 6 years in elementary school were in a one-room schoolhouse, and I had the same teacher for those 6 years. But then graduated from our local high school, which was not a large high school by any means. I was out of the educational process for a couple of years. My mother was an invalid at that time, and I was the only one left at home. But then I went to Roanoke College 2 years later. From Roanoke College, I came to Southern Seminary. At Southern Seminary was where I met Annette. The Methodists did us Lutherans in this part of the country a great favor in establishing a girls' school 2 blocks from our seminary. Now, in the years I was in seminary, we were all young men just out of college. And it's amazing how many pastors' wives in the South were graduates of Columbia College. My first parish then was back to East Tennessee, to Greene County, St. James and Solomon churches. I was there for just a couple of years when the call came to Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Now, remember, this was in 1953. The Manhattan Project was still a huge undertaking, in spite of the fact that, of course, the bomb had already been dropped, and people were trying to live with the aftermath of what happens when you have been in a project that really changed the shape of all humanity. What do you do with it from there on? How destructive is it? How constructive can it be? And so I went to Oak Ridge when it was an established church, was already included in the United Lutheran Church in America. Remember, I've been in 3 churches. I was there for 13 years. That experience really shaped me and my ministry, I think, probably more than any other single thing, because it was such a challenging group. Our congregation was just about 300 members. I went there as a young pastor, and there were 50 PhDs in the congregation, and there were world-renowned physicists there, and so forth. So the challenge of speaking to that group every week for a 28-year-old pastor was a tremendous challenge.
Some of them were Germans.
Yes. So we did have some Germans in the congregation, but our people were from all over, because when the Manhattan Project was founded, that place in East Tennessee was taken to be the site because there was absolutely nothing there. So the government bought thousands of acres. It was close to the Tennessee River, and of course they needed a supply of water, and it was a part of the Tennessee Valley system, so that the electricity was available. So that in one summer, the government built a town for 80,000 people. And so the people were from all over. There were only 2 native Tennesseans in the congregation, and I was one of them. But that was a fascinating parish. One of my early ambitions was to be a seminary professor, but I fell so much in love with the congregation and being a congregational pastor that I wanted to do graduate study, and I did during those years, some at Chicago. But I gave up that ambition of being a seminary professor. Then the call came to Ascension Church in Savannah in 1966. This was one of our old churches out of the Salzburger tradition, so that it was founded in 1734. Now you put that over against Oak Ridge. The congregation was in difficulty. The civil rights struggle was rife in Savannah at those times. And it was not the kind of task that I particularly was enthusiastic about, but it was very obvious that there's a desperate need. So I went to Savannah. I was pastor there for 8 years when I was elected secretary of the church. I was elected secretary in 1974, served the term until 1978. When Dr. Marshall decided not to take another term, I was elected president. In 1980 then, the title was changed to bishop. So, you see, I was the first bishop the ELCA ever had. I was the last bishop the ELCA ever had. So that you conclude I was the only bishop the ELCA ever had.
You are the Alpha and the Omega.
And, well, I wouldn't want to use that term. But yes. And I was also the only one in the history of the church that had filled the two offices of the church.
Mergers in the American Lutheran experience are not a unique event. They happen over and over.
Which is an important point that many people do not understand, that Lutheranism in the United States was an immigrant church, and the ties were more to the old country than to the people that might have settled just up the river, who also had the same confession. So there's been a series of mergers. I said a moment ago that I was ordained in the United Lutheran Church in America. And in East Tennessee, we were a part of the Virginia Synod. Now that goes back to the way immigrants settled and so forth. But the United Lutheran Church in America, from its very inception in 1918, had as one of its main objectives the willingness to unite with all Lutherans, all who had the same confession on its territory, and to work for that consolidation as soon as possible. Some of the very strong documents that are in 1920, then in 1934, what's called the Savannah Resolution, etc. So that all of that came to focus in 1962 with the formation of the Lutheran Church in America. Now, at that time, in 1962, it would have been desirable on the part of the United Lutheran Church in America to make the merger broader than it was, and the leaders had to deal with what was possible at that time. But then when the Lutheran Church in America was formed, it had that provision in the preamble to the Constitution that because we believe that it is the will of God in Christ that there be a unity in the church, that there be one church. And that preamble refers specifically to John 17, Jesus' high prayer that they may be one. So that from the very beginning of my background in the United Lutheran Church in America and in the Lutheran Church in America, it was already presupposed that our intention was to work for a new church. And because that was in our constitutional documents, and we always took those documents very seriously, there was no question as to what direction the church wanted to go, or where I, as the leader of that church, had the responsibility to try to work it through. No, merger is not a new thing among Lutherans in the United States. It's interesting to me that, let's take the period at around 1800. I think it's true that there were up toward 100 Lutheran organizations in the United States. Some would be just one congregation, but they would keep the ties with the old country rather than with other Lutherans.
Having the desire or the constitutional mandate to have unity and actually sitting down to talk about it, to getting the ball rolling, are two different things. At what point did that begin? When did it was that under Marshall's time? Was it under your time? When did the process actually start?
Well, the relationship between Bob Marshall and Kent Knudsen, who was then president of the American Lutheran Church, was a very close relationship. As a matter of fact, I think they had actually discussed between themselves as to how putting the churches together might work, and had agreed that there was practically no obstacle in the way. But then there was the untimely death of Kent Knudsen. Now, when Preuss became president of the ELCA, David had a different kind of conviction, which is very obvious, and he will still point out that he felt very strongly about this all the way through, that it was not the time for a merger, and that he really was opposed to the idea of one Lutheran church, that there was great advantage, as he saw it, into the separate church bodies, but cooperating in many ways. Now, of course, the National Lutheran Council had been formed, and the National Lutheran Council was responsible for a number of things, such as World Hunger Program, refugee programs, relationship with the Lutheran World Federation, etc., for years. Then in, I think it was 1974, the ALC-LCA Committee on Church Cooperation was formed. Now, first of all, in that committee, there was the idea, what projects are there that we can do together? Are we spinning our wheels at places, or are we spending money that doesn't need to be? How can we be more effective? Now, Dr. Preuss was very much upfront that this was the direction that should be taken. The LCA commissioners from the beginning also said, well, that's fine. That's really not our intention. Our purpose is to work toward a merged church as soon as possible. Now really, that committee on church cooperation had hardly gotten off the ground doing its work when the AELC came to be, when there was the split in the Missouri Synod, and the Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches became a reality. This was in 1978. And almost immediately, because they saw themselves as an interim church, not as something that would exist for the long term, they issued a call to union. Both the ALC and the LCA responded to that, but in somewhat different ways. But then in 1979, the AELC became a part of that Commission on Church Cooperation. And then from that point until the formation of the Commission for a New Lutheran Church, that the three church bodies were working together.
Isn't it ironic that a dispute that arose in the Missouri Synod Church wound up being the quicksilver or the catalyst that is that an accurate statement?
Yes. Yes, I think it's very much an accurate statement. It meant, you see, that the kind of initiative toward merger that the LCA was committed to from the beginning, that here was another initiative that the LCA could very easily tie into, but it meant also that the ALC had a new obstacle, a new difficulty to get through, and it took a while and a number of meetings to work that out until and finally in the commission itself we could never come to an agreement. Where we did come out was the fact, well, isn't it time to ask the church bodies where they are? And so we set up a system whereby in the synods and districts a poll was taken as to what is your preference? Is this the time for being together in a new church? And in all the church bodies, the poll was overwhelming, including the ALC. Dr. Preuss was very much surprised at that. But of course that did change the tactics, because he was always conscientious of trying to be where the church was and to do what the church wanted done. Now, that meant we were still coming from different places, because I had grown up with the idea that there ought to be one Lutheran church. And Dr. Preuss was now faced with the fact, well, I have to work for a new Lutheran church. But in many ways, I'm still somewhat reluctant. He kept saying this publicly. I'm not revealing any confidence about Dr. Preuss. But then, after that poll came in from all of our synods and districts, things moved quite rapidly. I think this was in 79, so that it was possible for us to work out for the 82 conventions of our church. There were some options involved in it, but to work toward a new church body. I think most of those options had been in the poll before, and the poll came out strongly for the merged church. So that in our conventions in 1982, we had that dramatic moment when each convention was voting on the resolution, and then we had a telephone hookup in which we tried to report what the other church body had done, so that it didn't become a public matter before the other church had to vote on it. So in this afternoon, from the AELC, all positive, no negative votes. From the ALC, strongly positive, though there were several negative votes. And from the LCA, again, all positive with very few negative votes. And so I remember my concluding remark in that telephone hookup that was going to all the conventions now was, my friends, there will be a new Lutheran church. Then there was the establishment, again in that same year, the Commission for a New Lutheran Church, with the timeline of trying to work this out by 1988. It could blow your mind if you have any idea about the intricate organizations of a large church body. And if you want to settle all the questions before you begin, you can't quite do it this way.
Wow. Once you made that statement, it was there a point where you went back to your hotel room and thought, well, here's something we've kind of thought about and looked toward for many, many years, and now the church bodies have said, yes, let's do this, but now you got to kind of put your money where your mouth. I mean, you must have been. I'm gonna stop. Hold on to that thought. You must have been sick, because we're gonna lose your mic there. You must have been sick, because now you got to make it a reality.
Well, no, I felt very good, very positive about it at that point. Where I became more disturbed was in the work of the Commission for a New Lutheran Church. In the Committee of Lutheran Unity, which included the 3 church bodies now, there was some discussion, of course, as to how we ought to go about this process. And this was the place at which the idea of representation to the Commission came up. It was decided before long that the Commission would be 70 members, but then there was a strong opinion as to how those 70 members should be divided. First of all, between clergy and lay, because we were all accustomed in our conventions to having that distinction. But then the idea came in from a meeting that had been held under the auspices of our Division for Mission in North America, and Pastor Hertzfeld came from that meeting to the meeting of the Commission with the strong mandate from that meeting that we also have a wider representation. In other words, that there be so many women, so many men, that there be so many minorities, etc. Now, excuse me, this gave me a real problem at that point, because it was a very definite conviction in the Lutheran Church in America that you had a representation, you had a group that you were representing, to which you were responsible. Now, not that we sent delegates with the idea, now, you must vote what the folks back home want. You must vote your own convictions, but that you were responsible to a particular group. Now, I found it very difficult in that this had never been in any of our procedures before, to say that it's necessary, for example, to have a black, because there's a black constituency out there. This was the whole item of quotas that came up, and it plagued us all the way through, I think. We had it somewhat in our church bodies before, in the Lutheran Church in America, for example. When we passed the ordination of women, and we became very anxious to be instrumental as we made appointments to committees and commissions and so forth, that there be a full representation of women. Now, it wasn't easy, because if, for example, I was appointing a commission that was to do a certain kind of work, let's say in biblical studies, and as we got together and decided that the people who ought to do that work in biblical studies ought to be a certain group, that there ought to be pastors, but there also ought to be people with degrees in, say, New Testament studies, I wouldn't have available to me a woman who had a degree in New Testament studies at that time. So that we began to worry a bit about how are you setting up? How are you going to have an effective task, an effective project, unless the people who do that project are those who have developed expertise and experience in the background of it? Well, when we came to the Commission for a New Lutheran Church, one thing that surfaced very early is the fact that, well, now this is a new Lutheran church. We do not want to carry over into it any of the good points or bad points of the former church bodies. It's almost as if we want to form a new church body in a vacuum. That scared me. And as we went further into it, I became even more apprehensive because certain special interest groups began to have far more say, far more discussion than I felt really they ought to have. I recognized that this was coming because it had been developing back in the LCA. We had people who were beginning to organize around certain ideas or concerns. But when really you didn't have the LCA tradition back of it, or the ALC tradition, you had the ELC with no tradition. Suddenly, the people who had this kind of concern had far more determination in what was being done than had ever been true before. And there really was not a loyalty to a nominating or a presiding group, you know. And the chairperson was a layman. The person who served as secretary, we elected one of the group as secretary, but when Arnie Mickelson, for example, was doing all of the work, so forth, he was also a layman. It was very hard, and we came out of the theological conviction about these things. It was very hard to keep that theological conviction going, in spite of the fact that we had some of our very good theologians on that commission, like Dr. Marshall, George Anderson, Bill Lazarus. But it was that even people who might have the strong conviction this way had to be very sensitive of listening to the others. The Lutheran Church in America became more sensitive of listening to the AELC than they did to the Lutheran Church in America. And this wasn't all bad. I don't want to say it that way, but it gave us some very serious obstacles to overcome as we went along. Certainly, it could not be said that the New Lutheran Church was going to be a macrocosm of the LCA. We didn't want that. But at the same time, we had certain concerns in the Lutheran Church in America, and we were the largest of the churches, that it was difficult to lay out on the table and get the kind of concern for it that we felt was necessary. You see, from the very beginning, I was pushing that the first thing we ought to do is define the church. What do we mean by the church? It's anymore, I suppose, what we would call, what's our mission statement? But that we ought to define the church, and that structure ought to grow out of that. And I became difficult to live with sometimes during those sessions, simply because I sensed that the group was quite willing to deal with structures and to get that all in shape without ever developing a theological reason for where the church was. As a matter of fact, the statement on the nature of the church got into the Constitution at the last meeting of the Commission for a New Lutheran Church when all the matters of structure and all had already been settled. That bothered me because I was so insistent that you have to go from the other direction. And it didn't always happen that way.
Talk about, it sounds, I don't want to oversimplify it, but talk about the name. There must have been, where'd you come up with the name?
Well, you mean for the commission or
No,
for the ELCA? Well, that also was not easy. You see, I think the name for the commission was wrong, though it seemed to be the only thing we could come up with. Really, if you're talking about a new Lutheran church, there is no such thing. If you, the church has a history, a long history, so that, but that began to, even that name began to get the thinking of the commission, I felt, in something of the wrong channel. Now, when we came to the ELCA, that was not easy. First of all, you recognized it couldn't be either American Lutheran Church or Lutheran Church in America. Even the way in which the name America might get into it might bother the folks in the Caribbean, for example. And so that had to be worked through, and finally had a rather strong statement that the doesn't bother us. And of course, very early, the idea that evangelical ought to get into it, and I think most of us bought that. In other words, we recognize that Lutherans are evangelical. Now, how to put those together was not such a large discussion that involved strongly different points of view. None of us had that much to lose in that particular one. But then I was bothered when it erupted that the American Evangelical Lutheran Church was already the name of a Lutheran church body. And they had laid claim to that in legal documents and so forth. Now, Bishop Schulstrom was a strong proponent for the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, for the ELCA, and he took it on himself to consult with probably the leader of that small church. And I don't know that there was an agreement reached, but that it was felt that there was not going to be a lawsuit over the name or anything of that kind. And so putting together especially the term evangelical and the term America, and of course we wanted it said Lutheran Church. There was actually a proposal that we drop the name Lutheran, but that didn't get very far. And so that, oh yes, there was some discussion about the name, but that discussion did not bring up any of the strong feelings that were expressed in many issues that came up.
In the CNLC, and then those days leading up to the actual formation.
But the ALC and the LCA, and particularly through the Lutheran World Federation, had been a part ever since the mid or early 70s of the churches. And those dialogues had made truly good progress. In Lutheran, it was our constitutional mandate to be a part of the ecumenical scene and to develop that unity in whatever ways were possible. For I had a deal of it. As a matter of fact, he and I had exchanged letters, and the relationship with the Reformed church bodies had developed past conventions. The ALCA and the ELCA took a different stance. The report of that dialogue did the Lutheran Church in America. It was odd because we had always been the more anxious about its working out, and yet at the last minute we were more reticent about adopting it. And then the one with the Episcopal Church, with the Anglican Church, had developed in a very positive way. Now, it's important to remember, I think, that, again, that all of us had been a part of this, so that when the provision for the sharing of the Eucharist between Lutheran and Episcopal churches, when that was adopted in 1980, and when Bishop Preuss and Bishop Cohn, see Will Herzfeld's predecessor, and I stood at the altar of the National Cathedral with Bishop Allen, Allen, with Bishop Allen. This was a really high point for me. Now, Dr. Preuss, while he was there and participated in it, it was not the kind of thing that he particularly liked or wanted to do. And he pointed out to me later that really in the West, we have little experience with Episcopalians. And of course, we in the East had a strong experience going back a long way with the Episcopalians. Well, it was obvious all the way through that the next step, after the sharing of the Eucharist became an agreement between us, the next step was going to be the one that was adopted by the ELCA now, that has to do with the installation of bishops, etc. See, as a bishop of the Lutheran Church in America, I had preached the sermon at the installation of the Episcopal presiding bishop, so that there had been a very close relationship there. I could begin to see in CNLC that whole ecumenical scene was going to run into a buzzsaw somewhere. Not much in CNLC, but we were not setting the stage for a strong ecumenical commitment. That one worried me a great deal. And not having the nature of the church central to the whole document and the whole process worried me a great deal. So that I began to see that the ELCA was going to be quite a different church from the LCA. All right, now this is all right. But where are the points in which it is going to be different? The least thing that bothered me was whether the structure was going to be different or not. I didn't care just where you put this responsibility or that responsibility. I was anxious that the whole thing hang together in a good way. But I was very much concerned as to whether there was going to be a spirit and a commitment and a dedication to an ecumenical process whereby the ELCA would be known as a church that was open to the process and was anxious to take its position, a very strong position that had been developed in the LCA between Catholics and Orthodox and Episcopalians and Reformed and Lutheran. I was very much concerned about that, and I could see that slipping. And that bothered me so much that I did call for a meeting of our bishops right toward the end of the CNLC, at which they agreed that there were some basic points that needed to be covered. Now, this was before the last meeting of the CNLC. One of those was the nature of the church, that document. The second was the ecumenical commitment. And we had some other things we were concerned about, quotas and how that would work through. At the last meeting of the CNLC, the ecumenical commitment, the nature of the church, were put into the Constitution proposed for the ELCA. And David Preuss was the one that moved that they be put in there. Now, it was not a popular thing with the other members of the commission. It wasn't popular with David either, but it was a way of getting through an impasse at that point.
Almost like having a spat at the rehearsal dinner.
Oh, yes, in some ways it was that strong or even stronger because, well, it was our feeling in the LCA that these particular things had to be safeguarded or the church would be so different that the thing that was so much a part of our understanding and tradition would be in jeopardy.
Describe for me the culture of the LCA and how it differed culturally from the ALC.
Well, I'm no sociologist, and I'm not sure that I can do this accurately, Tim.
From your perspective.
But I've got some definite ideas in that. You see, I pointed out that I was ordained in the United Lutheran Church in America. The United Lutheran Church in America was largely a federation of synods. When the merger took place, whereby the Lutheran Church in America was formed, remember that one of the very significant bodies there was Augustana, the Swedish background. Dr. Fry, who was president of the Lutheran Church, of the United Lutheran Church in America for 25 years, and a strong ecumenical person and so forth. Dr. Fry was very anxious that the new church would be church rather than federation. And Augustana was precisely what he was looking for in that regard. So that he and I think Conrad Bergendorf was probably the main voice here, put together this short portion, 3 paragraphs I think, on the nature of the church. And that provided the background for a development of certain attitudes toward the church and working within the church in the LCA. Now it says that congregations are important, but that the church at large is also church, and that therefore you do not have to just look to a congregation to decide what the church at large ought to do. Even questions, can a church convention have a communion service that is not adopted or approved by a congregation? Well, so the Lutheran Church in America was born with a real sense of church. Now that goes back a ways because that's the Muhlenberg tradition. You see, and was very important in the whole eastern United States. The Muhlenberg tradition that first of all put the church, very important. The church must be planted. There must be the church. And then the idea that the ministry, the ordained ministry, is important. It is not just something the church decides to have. It is a gift of God to the church, so that the ordained ministry is important. So that we've had some trouble as we've discussed other ministries that have been developing. So that you began to develop in the Lutheran Church in America this strong concept of church, a strong concept of a convention of the church. For instance, it was definitely the idea. Now, when you come as a delegate from the South Carolina Synod to the convention of the Lutheran Church in America, you are there not just to represent the South Carolina Synod. You are there to help decide what is best for the church. And of course, your constituency that may have strong ideas may influence where you are, but that is not your line of responsibility. Your line of responsibility as a delegate to the convention is to the church and not to the Synod. That meant then that we began to develop what I would consider a very good way, some would question it, a very good way of handling issues, because it meant that we would go to great lengths before a convention, before a major issue was to come to a convention, at great lengths to study it, to develop it, to process it throughout the synods and everything else. But when you came to the convention and it was adopted, that was the policy of the church. And that was recognized all the way through. We had, remember now, we had 33 bishops. There was a very strong camaraderie among the bishops, and a very strong sense of loyalty to each other and to the church. And that prevailed throughout, so that we didn't get a lot of the infighting. Oh, sure, some of it was going, it always will be an organization. But we didn't get a lot of that infighting as to what the policy was. And if the policy had been developed, that it would be implemented. You don't have a constitution to ignore. A convention is run by Robert's Rules of Order. And as I was always the presiding officer at the convention, Dr. Fry, and of course as a young pastor I'd seen him operate at the convention, Dr. Fry was probably the outstanding parliamentarian in the United States. Congress or any place else notwithstanding. That was our pattern. You had
intimidating.
He was very intimidating to him. But it was the pattern that there is a way in which you make a decision, and the way is important because it's the only fair thing that you can do. But if you go through that process, once the decision is made, you live with it and you implement it. Sure, it can be changed at a former time, but until it is changed, you live with it in the church. Now, that also developed in the way in which organizationally we did business, you see. So that when you had the different divisions in the church working together in the bishop's cabinets and so forth, again, there was a strong relationship among them. And the same thing is true with the Executive Council. Now, with the ALC, and I am, of course, not the authority to speak on this, but remember that church had a different background. It wasn't the Muhlenberg background. It was the background, rather, whereby the congregations were predominant. And you had conventions only as kind of counselor to congregations. And it was far easier for congregations or for districts to say, that's not the way we, that's not the policy of our church. We will make our own policy. So that there was not the fabric that held together in the same way. And the same thing was true. I oftentimes was a visitor, of course, to the ALC conventions. Totally different from the way an LCA convention would operate. For as you would get motions and counter motions and substitute motions and all this kind of thing, so that at one time I remember they had a very difficult morass. And David Preuss, in presiding, was I don't know exactly where we are. Now let's start back over. You couldn't have done that in the LCA. The bishops, the whole group would not have permitted it. But you see, there was a different sense of the church. And particularly with the Haugian tradition, there was a different sense of the ordained ministry. You see, our church was defined as congregations and ordained ministers. The ALC was defined as congregations. And then the ELCA is defined as baptized members. And you see, that's another thing that bothered me as I saw the ELCA developing. Where are the lines of responsibility? They haven't been very clear. They weren't clear as the CNLC reported and the ELCA adopted it. It's been a part of our problem. I hope we're getting out of that now, but it's been a part of our problem all the way through, you know. You have to have a time to define operation. You can have things written out that are very clear, but there is still a spirit that has to develop whereby the clarity of that which is written becomes the clarity of the operation. And that's taken a while. You would expect it to take a while. Of course it does. We didn't expect it to take so long, the ELCA.
Looking back now, with some time and some perspective, where do you see in the process through the 1970s and 80s, where it's clear to you now that you could see the Holy Spirit at work, where maybe it wasn't so obvious at the time, but now you see more clearly?
Well, at the end of the CNLC, at the last meeting, I asked for the special privilege of saying that we had come to a church now, or to the proposal for a church that I could fully accept as my church and live in very happily, etc., recognizing all of the things that were going to be necessary in the future. There were many specific points as you look back through the history, and particularly what is now the written history of this process, where it seemed utterly impossible to make a decision. And even with our best processes, you know, of going to the constituency and polling, where is this, that, and the other, there was an absolute impasse, it seemed. I can point to several of those places if I'm looking at the written history, where the solution that came out was an unforeseen solution and almost a miraculous solution. There are 2 or 3 places where we were at each other's throats and hitting our head against a stone wall, and there was a suggestion, and everybody agreed to it. There is no question that the Holy Spirit was at work among us. In fact, we could never have gotten anywhere without that. You see, to coalesce all of this into 6 years, it's an impossible task to begin with. And when you complicate that with, it's a good complication, but it's definitely a complication. When you point out to all of your constituency at all of the steps along as to where you are, so that immediately the constituency gets the resolution that we worked at this morning. They get that this afternoon. You see, our technological age made a very real complication, I think. It was a tremendous help. We could never have done it in the 6 years without that. And it kept the constituency informed, but that also means that the constituency was very helpful at certain points of decision making. When it was obvious things looked different out there to what it looked to 2 different church presidents sitting there. And see, it was such a different process from the formation of the Lutheran Church in America, when it was done by the church leaders.
Messier?
Messier. And particularly for those of us who were so intent on being precise, impossible, not just Messier, but impossible. But then to recognize, as as it's important to recognize, that there are many factors there are many people playing into a position. And to recognize that the Spirit may be working with someone who disagrees with you very much. And I think some understanding of that helped from time to time. I think Bill Kinnison did a very good job in sharing that, in pointing out to us. He was very forthright time and again as to where we as commissioners were, and that we really weren't doing our job. Now you've got to get with it, and you've got to listen to each other more and to the constituency more. The thing that prevailed, that none of the polls ever approved, or that the constituency never approved, the item that prevailed, you know what it is? Quotas. The CMLC still insisted on putting that in. It became a part of the Constitution. The constituency voted against that at every point.
Are you glad it worked out?
Oh yes. Oh yes. I think there are many very positive things that you would have to say about being together in the ELCA. That I think set further along the journey some of the things that I delighted in so much in the LCA, and that I was so much concerned about in the LCA. In other words, I can see that those things that are there. I really have worried when the whole ecumenical scene practically fell apart, because the Lutheran Church in America was the leader in that whole ecumenical arena. And yet, things like the covenant with the Catholic Church came into being. I was very much concerned that worked out. And in fact, I chaired the last international dialogue on the church and justification, which was just before the adoption of the covenant. But you see, that's something that I would have laid my whole career on the line for, and it's happened. I don't know where the thing with the Episcopalian is going to work out. That still worries me terrifically. Because you see, I really cannot see where all of the problem that has arisen, so that many people are actually willing to cause a division in the church over how you install a bishop, and whether or not a bishop ordains the people in the synod that have finished the process. You see, that had become the policy in the Lutheran Church in America. All of our bishops made it a point to do the ordaining. In the time that I was bishop, there were 18 synodical bishops. There were 18 changes. I always installed, as the presiding officer, I installed those synodical bishops in place. So all of this is not strange for the Lutheran Church in America, though many of the people that are taking such strong exception now are members of the Lutheran Church in America. Not the leaders in it, but there's a lot of folks. I think both Dr. Marshall and Dr. Preuss have pointed out, or were pointing out, some places that they were very unhappy about it. I have been firmly committed to that all the way through. Not that I have wanted super bishops, but rather that I have felt that church leadership, the right church leadership, is vital. And it has to be such that it carries up into itself the very nature and function of the church. See, I would have opposed the use of the term bishop in 1980. The LCA recognized that I was not for that. But now, the reason I was not for it was I wanted the church to define what it meant by bishop before it used the term. Because I knew just as soon as the term was used, well, is that the same as a Roman Catholic bishop? Is he in the Roman Catholic tradition? Does he have the right to wear the mitre and to be vested with all of the pomp and circumstance of the Roman Catholic episcopacy? You see, the church had never dealt with that. It just changed the Constitution. So that the Constitution then read, the bishop is the chief presiding officer of the church. You see, I wanted to be something other than CEO. And the way it did come through, the bishop is the chief pastor of the church, which is the way I had always seen it. And in spite of the fact you've got an executive position, of course, but the way you do that is from a pastoral position.
Final remarks?
How can one be final about something that still is so dynamic, Tim? I have had some real concerns about the ELCA. I worried for some years that there just wasn't any focus that I can find coming out. I felt the ELCA was not in the influential position in the World Council of Churches or even in the Lutheran World Federation that both the ALC and the LCA had been beforehand, that we had lost something of that impetus. It may have been lost anyway, because you have to deal with the fact that the times have changed very much in the last 20 years. And I could see some of these changes coming that would have had to be dealt with if we had remained separate churches. I worried very much about the budget impasse in the beginning. I had hoped we were all beyond that. I should have recognized even more that you have to build, and it takes some years to build, a certain loyalty within a church body. And that's even more important these days because you do not have the denominational and confessional loyalty that we had in a different day. People join churches for reasons other than they're Lutheran or they're Methodist or they're Episcopal. And so you have to deal with the loyalty of the group in a different way today. Now, that means that you have to give a different importance to diversity. Of course, that has become the catchword in the ELCA, as was so very obvious at the assembly last summer. Now that's fine, but you also come to a limit as to how much diversity an organization can tolerate. How much diversity in worship can you have and still say it is Lutheran worship? How much diversity in practice can you have and still say there is here the long Catholic tradition, small c, Catholic tradition of the church, these 20 centuries of the church is not being put aside. So that how are you going to settle questions like homosexuality? I knew in the LCA we would have a real difficulty settling that too. But you see, when all of these pressures come in that are such large issues today, and you try to deal with each one of them by compromising somewhat, where do you get to the place that you're no longer a part of your own confessional family? That's a tremendous issue. And I haven't seen the place just yet at which you can work that. I think our church is struggling in the middle of some unresolved issues. That the struggle is going to be with us for a while, I think, Tim. I don't see the way we can solve it. I don't see the way we can solve the homosexual issue now. I'm hoping it'll be clear out there somewhere. I don't think you can solve it simply by saying we're going to study it and study it and study it and study it, because each time you set up a new study and make a different appointment to the study group, you're beginning to change the direction of that issue. And I've seen that happen too often. So I think that we're in a definite process at which there are some really tough issues. I would not be anxious to be bishop of this church. It was almost an impossible task in the LCA. And I think in the ELCA we still haven't found the place that the bishop fills. You see, it was different with us. I presided at the convention. I presided at the executive council. I presided over the conference of bishops. I was the chief representative of the ELCA in all organizations where we held membership. Now that was all you put all of that together and you see where my time was spent. Now, I'm not sure that I would want that same pattern in the ELCA, but I want more of a place for the leadership of the church. I think there has to be leadership. We have to know where the bishop is and what the bishop is thinking. And now, that doesn't mean the bishop has to be dogmatic or very authoritarian, but there has to be some leadership there. Well, I'd say the same thing about a congregation or any group of us that we're getting at. I think that's difficult in the ELCA. Some things that I was sure were not going to work. See, when we had the idea that there ought to be so many synods that the bishop would be in close personal contact with every congregation, every pastor. And that's the reason we set up all of the synods that we did. And then some members in CNLC were so unrealistic as to say, all you really need is a bishop and a secretary in a synod. Now, David Proyas and I both raised, that's impossible. Well, what you've seen is that synods have built quite large staffs and so forth. It is not unusual for synods to have staffs of 12, 15 people today. I knew that was going to happen. I'm not sure that you have, by providing so many synods, you have really arranged for the close personal contact with the congregations and the pastors, because I don't see that happening. There are some ways in which it happened better in what, for instance, was our Central Pennsylvania Synod, which was the largest synod. But the bishop had developed a way of working with staff whereby the congregations and the pastors did have a contact point, and the bishop would fill that as needed. But in that large synod, I don't think there was the sense of distance between the congregation and the bishop that there is in a lot of our smaller synods today. That's all got to be worked out. And there again, it's a question of leadership. But I would hope that we're working at it deliberately. I don't know whether we are or not, because I have no official connections anywhere anymore. I'm glad to see that part of the financial crunch has been resolved. I wouldn't say resolved, because there's always such a much greater need than we ever fulfill. But I've been very happy to see some things that have happened with the world hunger and things like that. So that I think we're on the right track, and I hope we will keep going along that track. There are many things about the church that I simply have to say I do not know. I have felt a considerable distance from there. You are the first time the ELCA has contacted me for anything. That's true. since 1988.
Wow.
I have been invited to the assemblies, but only to be there. And the last time it was pointed out, we won't have a chance even to introduce you, but we'd like to have you there. When I was, I still carried some of the LW, Lutheran World Federation responsibilities, because I was still chair of the Constitution Committee that brought about the major change in Curitiba. But from the ELCA, would you believe that for the first 2 yearbooks of the ELCA, I was left out? My name wasn't even in the list of pastors.
Wow.
There have been times that I would have liked to have sat with the bishop of the church and talked about some things. But that has to be the bishop's initiative, not mine. Because there's no way in which I'm going to try to influence because of a former position I held where the church is.